I'll show you how to make miniature books with clay covers using a variety of techniques I came up with. This was so much fun, I could not stop making these. This project was inspired by this book, Making Dollhouse Miniatures with Polymer Clay by Sue Heaser. I initially borrowed this from the library, but it's such a great book I bought my own copy. I'm following the instructions to make these leather tooling stamps. These give the polymer clay an embossed leather appearance. I'm using scrap clay to make the stamps. I like to use this clay whenever I'm casting a mold or I'll be painting polymer clay. I need to roll the clay into a log. You can roll them by hand, or you can use a flat piece of glass or acrylic stamp block to get a nice even roll. I straightened the logs, cut them to have a blunt end on each end, and bake them at 270 for about 15 minutes, but pay attention to the instructions for your own clay. For my first stamp, I'm using my craft knife to cut a very simple design into the baked clay. I'm slightly angling my blade to make a shallow channel into the clay, and then I turn my blade and cut another line so it looks like a plus sign. For the other end of the same stamp, I cut 3 lines side by side. For my next set of stamps, I'm squaring off the end of the log by shaving off the sides. Now that I have this nice square shape, I just cut the same plus symbol in the center like I did on the round log. The other side got this little fan shape. I made another stamp by cutting little wedges into the side of this piece of wood. These are the tools we'll be using to make patterns in our clay book covers, so it's nice to test them on a scrap piece of clay to make sure you like the shape. I got the idea for the clay tooling stamps from Sue Heaser's book, but now I'm making some tools of my own invention. I'm cutting some short pieces of bamboo skewer with my miter shears. If you don't have miter shears, you can make a shallow cut with your craft knife by rolling the bamboo stick back and forth. And then you can just snap it and sand the ends. I gathered some beads and other bits and bobs to use at the end of my sticks to make some little stamping tools. I'm attaching all of the bits using some hot glue. To make them extra sturdy so I can stamp them into the clay without losing my bead ends, I added extra glue. I chose pieces with a relatively flat and shallow design so it won't press all the way through the clay book cover. This charm will create a nice look of a frame on the front of the book, but it's really hard to remove if it's just stuck flat into the clay. The bamboo handle will help it function more like a stamp. I'm attaching this flat loop of this vintage clothing hook to a scrap piece of paper since it wouldn't easily hang on to the bamboo skewer. Now that we have some tools, we need some books. I'll show you a few different techniques for making the pages, but first we'll start with some clay. I'm using a mass-produced book to copy the size of the pages. You can use simple rectangles of white clay as your pages, or you can add a bit more detail like I'm doing. I'm using the end of a paintbrush to add a curve to the pages. The book that inspired this project uses rectangles with flat sides, but I always like to add details and make a project my own. I'm using the edge of my blade to create the imprint of pages. I'm only curving and adding the lines to 3 sides since the flat side will be the spine of the book. I'm making this book look a bit used by curling the edges of the pages. I cut a very thin slice of the clay and curled it outward. I like when miniatures look like they've been used and they're not just brand new props sitting around a miniature space. I made 2 more book blocks the same way in different sizes. The pages for the rest of the books will be made from different materials, so you can hopefully find something you have at home to make your own books. Before I popped them into the oven, I used my craft knife to create a little slit so I can add a bookmark. Before baking, I added a strip of parchment paper so the clay won't bake together and close up my slice. When I added the cover, I made sure it was straight because the cover would still be straight even if the pages were curled. I'm adding detail to the spine first using a pumpkin carving saw and a flat blade. I attached the cover to the baked clay using liquid clay. I'm using one of these cheap miniature frames that are meant for decorating your fingernails to impress a pattern in the front of my book. The relatively flat frame suctioned to the soft clay surface and was really hard to remove without damaging the unbaked clay cover. I had to use a variety of different tools and come at it from multiple angles. I probably should have attached some bamboo handles to the frame. It's a shaky start, but I did eventually remove it with only slight denting of my cover. For a completely different look, you could make a mold of your miniature charm, fill it with clay, and add it to your book cover. Rather than stamping an impression, this would make a 3D decoration. I'm adding a bit more detail using a tiny watch gear glued to the end of a bamboo skewer. To prevent shaggy lines, I'm dragging a needle over the surface of the clay and using some thin plastic as a barrier. I learned this trick from north of the border, but a lot of clay artists do this. Before baking, I made sure to straighten out the corners in the book pages so they wouldn't be forever wonky. I baked all of my books at once in the oven at 270 for about 20 minutes. I'm finishing this fine baked book with a very simple detail of antique wax spread over the surface, wiping away the excess. All the excess wax gets caught in the details I created with my various tools. If I had made this using tan or brown clay or painted the clay before adding the wax, this really would look like embossed leather. In a previous video, I showed you how you can use the glued spines of magazines and catalogs to make miniature books. I cut off this 1-inch piece to make a large book, but since it's a bit too thick, I'm tearing it into 2 books. To ensure the polymer clay covers stick, remove any shiny or finished pages. I learned it's best to glue the pages together before baking to prevent the polymer clay covers from becoming misshapen. I'm using some more of my scrap clay to beef up the spine of my book. Some books have a really round spine and I'm trying to simulate that look. I don't want the spine to project too much, so I'm not cutting the log perfectly in half. I'm cutting it a bit off center so one side of the log is smaller than the other. I'm using regular white PVA glue to attach the unbaked clay to the paper book. You of course can also use a liquid polymer clay if you have some. For many of the books I used a solid color of polymer clay, but I'll be painting this one so I'm using my scrap clay. I'm making the cover by cutting 2 parallel lines that are slightly longer than the book form. You can use a pattern if you prefer, but I just eyeballed the size by folding the front and back book covers and giving them a trim. I'm adding my first bit of detail by pressing a bamboo skewer near the spine to indent it. I'm permanently attaching the front and back cover using some liquid clay, but you could also use white glue instead. The beauty of working with unbaked polymer clay is you can add stamps and embossed patterns that kind of look like tooled leather. I only own 1 stamp, so I'm using the chocolate on this cheap Temu miniature cake to stamp my book. This long, thin, flexible blade I have for cutting polymer clay really came in handy during this project. I mostly used it for trimming my book covers, but here I'm using the end to create this very simple pattern around the border of the book. I'm adding my first clay stamp in the bottom right corner. I'm using the plastic trick and writing the word magic with the end of a sewing pin. Since the theme of this book is magic, I added a magic wand in the bottom left corner. I could have done this while the plastic was still covering the cover, but I had jumped the gun and already removed it when I thought of this. I'm using just a small portion of the braided frame charm to add a little bit of detail in the top 2 upper corners. After baking, I decided to add some more depth to the lines using my craft knife. The craft knife was working pretty well, but a scribe is a better tool for this. I'm tracing over my letters with a sharp pointy tip, and I also added some new designs to the corners as well. Creating crisp, clean lines in the unbaked clay can be a bit tricky, so it's nice to be able to add details after it's baked. To make my tie-dye book look more like leather, I painted it a soft tan color. The neutral aesthetic was reading less leather and more sad beige mom of TikTok, so I decided to add some color. I made the magic wand look like it's glowing by painting the area white before covering it with lemon yellow with a darker yellow in the center. To make the metallic pop, I'm using some rub and buff I purchased recently from Michaels. It took me a while before I was willing to buy rub and buff because each of the little tubes is kind of expensive in my opinion, but they last forever and you really cannot beat the metallic sheen. They're also really easy to apply. I bought this product when I first started making minis for a miniature class I was taking, but I haven't used it very much. It's a high flow color, so I wanted to see if I could fill in the very thin lines I created on my book. I'm filling the lines simply by touching the brush to the end of the line. The really thin yet heavily pigmented liquid is filling in the very shallow cuts I made in the clay. I'm using some antique wax from Waverly to add a bit of age around the edges. This is my favorite product for staining wood and adding color to plastic Crimson Bond kits. I learned about Waverly Antique Wax from Tiny Keyhole Minis. I'm using some brown chalk pastels to add a bit more age. I'm finishing this book by adding some rub and buff into the braided frame indents and to the center of the wand. The ability to create texture is one of the advantages of using clay versus paper or some other material to make your book covers. I'm pressing cross-stitch fabric into my clay, but you can use other things like lace or linen. This is the second book I made during my 2 days of crafting. I used clay pages for the book insert. I created a marbled look in the clay by mixing in some white, but not all the way. I'm using just the top of this stamp to create a semicircle. I'm flipping the book upside down and using the stamp in a similar way to finish the bottom of the circles. Of course, as soon as I turned it right side up, I realized it looks like I'm making a face, so I tried to break up the illusion. Now it looks like 2 eyes and a huge nose, so I added some of my clay stamps to make it look less like a face. I'm using some acrylic metallic paint to highlight all of the details. I used a small brush to apply the paint and then wiped away some of the excess on the surface with a damp cloth. Now I'm stealing the pages from some miniature mass-produced books. I learned the lesson a little too late, but it's best to glue all the pages together for these books as well before baking. I also learned it's best to remove the faux leather cover so the clay can stick nicely. I'll be painting this book as well, so I'm using scrap clay as the cover. I made some simple lines and used my clay stamps to adorn the spine. I want this book to look like a journal, so I'm adding a strap. I'm using my Dollar Tree ball stylus to add some divots I can add rivets to later, and using the end of my craft knife to add some faux stitching. I'm using my bead end cap stamp to create a sun in the middle of the top of the book. I'm adding some really simple mountain tops and finishing with some detail along the spine. After baking, I coated it with my only color of nice paint. If you're tired of seeing this color on my channel, I sincerely apologize and promise I will venture to my local hobby store soon and buy another color or two. I'll be using these books in bookcases or on tables, so I didn't take the time to add any detail to the backs of my books. I'm adding some white to the sun as a base for yellow I'll add later, as well as to the peaks of the mountain tops. I only have 2 shades of brown from Model Color, so I'm mixing the paints on my books to give the mountains a slightly different color from one another. The spine and the strap are getting the faux leather treatment. The white base coat really helps the yellow ochre paint pop. To make life easier, I'm adding some details using a marker. I'm highlighting the stitching using some watered down black paint. I'm using some black and gold acrylic paint to highlight the details on the spine. To fill my grommet holes, I'm adding some really tiny caviar beads that are meant for decorating your fingernails. I'm adding the caviar beads with plain white glue because super glue is really shiny. We've made our book pages out of clay, catalog, ready-made books, and now I'm using some wood. I used my miter shears to cut 3 rectangles. I'm using a cheap round file to curve the page edges. I learned it's easiest to start the curve by holding the file flat on the table and moving the book block along it. Once you get the groove started, you can finish it in the air. I don't know why some book pages are curved like this, but I do know I like it. The clay covers were attached with the liquid polymer clay. To change up the texture of my polymer clay, I'm using a toothbrush to stipple in some dots. If you keep noticing glitter, it's because I got my liquid polymer clay in the clearance section at Michael's and it's filled with glitter. I like the design of these miniature 1/12 scale coat hooks, so I'm using it as a stamp in the center of the book. It's fun to look around at what you have to figure out what you can use to make impressions in your polymer clay book covers. I also used some small paper clasps to add some detail to each of the corners. I'm using one of my clay stamps to add some more detail to each of the flattened squares. I kept forgetting to add the texture to the spine of the book first. I'm protecting the details on my cover using some parchment paper. After baking, I decided to cover up all of this liquid polymer clay glitter using a dry brushing of black paint. I was able to spare the green detail of the spine. I'm highlighting the detail in the middle and the stamps in the corners using some silver rub and buff. This may have been a step too far, but I tried highlighting the texture on the spine using the rub and buff, but I think I liked the green more. I'm trying to revive some of that toothbrush texture using a dry brushing of dark gray paint. The book seemed a bit underwhelming and unfinished to me, so I added another detail using a silver string from a price tag. I held the string down in the back using some washi tape since I'll never look back there. To make the metallic string cooperate, I'm adding some glue to the knot and to the ends. I held it in place with a cheap Dollar Tree clip as it dried. Even though I covered up so much of the green, this book is still giving me Slytherin vibes. I was concerned the glued spine of the catalog would fall apart in the oven since heat softens glue. Since it turned out so well, I'm using the thinner section of the catalog to make a smaller book. I'm trimming some of the width off of the pages as well as some of the length to make the book shorter and shallower. I'm cutting a few pages at once rather than trying to cut through all of them at the same time to get nice straight lines that aren't staggered. I'm using Elmer's glue to attach the scrap clay as the cover. I learned the lesson at the end of all of my crafting, but remember to glue all of the pages together before you bake. Some of you may recognize this silicone nail mold I got in my Temu haul. This is meant for decorating your fingernails, but I'm filling mine with scrap clay to adorn the front of my book. Since I'm attaching unbaked clay to some more unbaked clay, I stuck the rose on the front and smoothed some of the edges down with a needle to help it attach a little better. I'm using a mold from Etsy to make the leaves for the rose. To make the rose look more natural, I used a larger leaf on the left side and one of the smaller ones on the right. I really love the 3D effect of the rose on the front. I'm rolling a thin length of clay to make a braided frame for my rose. I folded the long length of clay in half and twisted it at each end to make the braid. I really like the drama of this little frame and how much attention it draws to the rose and the leaves. If you don't have any molds, you can easily make your own flower and leaves. I linked a couple videos in the description. For some more detail, I'm using the blunt side of my craft knife to make lines in the corners. I added some lines to the spine as well and baked the book. I wanted this book to look like ivory, so I started with a white base coat followed by beige. I'm making the book lighter and highlighting the details by dry brushing with white. Once the paint dried, I sealed the book before the next step. To emphasize the details and hopefully make it look like ivory, I stippled on some Waverly Antique wax. I'm removing most of the wax with a damp paper towel, leaving it in the details and crevices. I don't want to remove the base layers of paint, which is why I sealed it before this step. It still didn't look like ivory to me even after dry brushing it, so I decided to add a little bit of color. I'm using some pastels to add color to the flower and the leaves. I'm highlighting the rope and other details using rub and buff. Some fancy books have gold pages, so I added that detail as well. I locked the chalk pastels in place by using a stippling motion and some matte Mod Podge. I'm making another green book with wood pages with a completely different look. I'm using a piping tip to cut out a nice clean circle and replacing it with a different color of clay that I cut with the same tip. I used some liquid polymer clay to attach the new circle of clay so the disc doesn't just fall off. I'm pretty pleased with myself because I remembered early in the process to add the detail to the spine. I'm adding a simple line to differentiate the spine and creating some texture using my craft knife. I'm dipping back into my Temu sweets, but this time I'm using a different stamp. I'm stamping this bit of chocolate 4 times across the center of my brown circle. I'm rolling the textured edge of a lid from a Dollar Tree glass jar across the top and the bottom of the book. I'm mimicking the look of a dotted line using the serrated edge of this pumpkin carver. Remember, I baked all of my books at the same time, making sure to straighten out the edges and the corners. With all the details locked in place, I'm highlighting the texture on the spine using some silver paint. One of the perks of using a solid color of clay is you can paint onto the surface, then wipe the paint away so it catches in all the details. I used gold to highlight the texture in the center and silver for the top and bottom. The spine was looking a bit too high contrast for me, so I decided to subdue the silver spine using some orange chalk pastel. If you have small clay cutters, you could add some really interesting designs to books like this. For this next book, I'm stamping it using some plastic sprue left over from a miniature kit. I'm showcasing the diagonal pattern in the center by using my blade to create multiple lines. To keep things nice and tidy, I'm using a Sharpie to add some black lines to the spine. I don't usually like when brown and black are paired together, but I think the red unifies these two colors. I'm using more of my panel line accent color to fill in the lines I created. I was removing the shiny covers of the pre-made books so the clay will stick easily, and then I got a brainwave to use the cover itself as a pattern. The cover worked well as a pattern when it came to copying the height, but it wasn't long enough and cracked along the spine. If you're planning to use a cover as a pattern, I suggest adding a little bit of length to avoid this problem. During the course of making these books, I realized one of my favorite details to add to the spine are these little thin snakes of clay. In traditional bookmaking, the ridges you see on the spine are actually the threads that are keeping the pages together. I'm giving this book a very traditional look by adding a little bit of an indent with a bamboo skewer and 3 simple stamps across the top. I'm texturing the bottom of the book to look like linen by rolling the handle of this tool. I'm highlighting the stamped detail on the front and wiping the excess paint away in an upward motion so it doesn't catch in the detail I created on the bottom of the book. I really like how classic this book looks. I think this would be a great design for creating an entire set of books like a set of encyclopedias. This next book was actually the first book I made. I salvaged 3 of these gold-edged wooden blocks from miniature books that were in rough shape. For this book, I wrapped the clay around the book and used scissors to cut the cover to size. I'm mimicking the look of a contrasting fabric spine by using a thin sheet of clay. I'm adding more detail to the spine using some thin snakes of clay. I don't know how successful this was, but I added some texture along the spine using some twisted aluminum wire I had left over from a clay animal project. I initially added some thin polymer clay to each of the corners and then realized I really don't like the thickness. I cut each of the corners off and used my blade to separate the 2 layers. I'm using some polymer clay to attach my triangles directly to the wooden block. This is how I should have attached the clay to the spine to reduce the bulk. I'm adding some gold to the surface to highlight all of the indents I created. Rub and buff doesn't work well for this technique because the coverage is too good, so I'm using cheap acrylic paint. I'm creating some dimension in all of the areas I indented using some Diamond Glaze. This product dries to a resin-like finish and creates a bit of dimension. I started out spreading it with my craft knife, but then I grabbed a toothpick instead, which is a much better tool. I added some to the spine as well. When it dried, it left these areas looking very shiny. For my next book, I'm rolling some texture across the entire front cover. I'm using the end of my round file to stamp out this diamond design. I indented a round circle in the center and used a needle to create a fan shape. My initial rolling created a shaggy edge, so I'm trimming that now. I have this gingerbread molding left over from a 1/44 scale kit. I'm using it to highlight the corners and outlining the center diamond I created earlier with the dots. Lots of books have some linen on their spines, so I'm using some of this fabric to create that detail. I'm attaching the fabric to the book using plain white glue. I added glue along the cut edges to prevent fraying. The white was a bit too high contrast for me, so I'm painting on some watered down brown paint. I'm adding the tiniest bit of metallic paint to highlight some of the details. For this book, I was mixing an earthy brownish green color, but I really liked the marbled effect of the green and the brown, so I decided to keep the clay partially mixed. For the spine, I'm doing something a little bit different and covering the entire spine with lines instead of just a couple at the top and bottom. I only own one stamp, but imagine all the great designs you can come up with if you have a slightly bigger collection. Stamps with some script writing would look particularly good on these little books, as well as those tiny stamps you can use to stamp individual letters. Combining stamps and embossing powder would also look fantastic. I must have Slytherin blood running through my veins because I can't seem to help adding some silver whenever there's green. I should have done this step before I painted the spine and the corners. After carefully wiping away the silver and touching up the black, I accented it with a bit of gold. Due to time constraints and lack of creativity, I'm keeping the parchment paper bookmark plain. I've been using blades to add lines to my spines, but I realized scissors create thicker lines, so they're a great option as well. This book got 4 stamps across the top and some texture from my tweezers along the bottom. I'm creating the impression of some writing using the end of a toothpick. If you add plastic to the surface, this will be a bit tidier. After baking, the pages were partially open and the cover cracked when I tried to squeeze it closed and glue it shut. This is why I suggest gluing your pages before baking. Make sure you check out the description if you'd like to learn how to make open books. It's a simple method, but I don't want to give away Sue Heaser's tricks. After a bit of repair with some wood glue, I covered the entire book with some silver leaf rub and buff, trying to retain some of the red. To create some age and capture some detail, I added a watered-down wash of acrylic paint. I left it pooled on the surface, and this is how it dried. Most of the shimmer you've been seeing on the books is because of my clearance liquid polymer clay that has glitter in it. This particular clay is from Fimo and has a metallic shimmery finish. For this particular book, I think I was trying to use every tool imaginable at the same time. By the end, this book reminds me of a 19th century cross-stitch sampler that has every letter and every detail imaginable. I intended to keep it the blue metallic clay, but then I decided to make it look like embossed leather by painting the whole thing and stippling on some other colors to age it. I'm finishing with some gold acrylic paint and brown marker. I think I may have preferred this book when it was just painted one solid shade of brown, so make sure you don't add too many details. This is probably the fastest type of book to make. I used a mass-produced book as the base with glued pages. I added some simple lines to the spine and stamps across the front. You can leave the book plain or highlight the indents using some cheap acrylic paint you wipe away, but I decided to cover mine in rub and buff. The yellow book from earlier was still bugging me, so I used the remnants of the rub and buff on my brush to add some gold highlights to that book as well. To create more depth and interest, I gave each book a coat of some watered-down acrylic paint. To further age my previously red book, I'm adding some black chalk pastels. I'm concentrating it around the edges, but added some to the entire book. You can play around by using different colors of chalk pastels to alter your metallics, like blue or red or whatever tickles your fancy. For my final trick, I rolled this book across the surface of my clay and used my blade to cut a cover slightly bigger than the book. If you do this on wax paper or parchment paper, it'll be easier to remove from your surface without accidentally stretching it out of shape. I considered embedding a tiny mirror into the cover, but then I took a different direction. This book cover is a bit thicker than the other ones I've been using, so all of the details end up being more dimensional. I used some stamps and wrote the word hiss across this book. To make the gold more vibrant on this green background, I started out by adding yellow ochre, followed by some of my cheap metallic acrylic paint. I'm finishing with the black and brown chalk pastels for age and dimension. I'm storing my tools in a baggie to be used next time, but I only have one of these little frame charms, so I popped it off of the hot glue. I'd love to hear which are your favorites and any ideas you have. I'd like to thank all of my patrons and encourage you to join my Patreon as a free or paying member for $3 a month. You can check out this video next if you want to learn how to make your own books and magazines without using any technology like a printer.